Hello everybody, I trust you are having pleasant holidays. By now you should have started to read Jane Eyre, and if you haven't, this is your friendly reminder to start doing so. Now this video was put together in order to help you get a little bit of context about the book you're going to read. Jane Eyre was published by Charlotte Brontë in 1847. Now, in 1847, it had been 10 years since Queen Victoria had been crowned. So we are at the beginning of what we call the Victorian era. As you well know, this was the Industrial Revolution. Now, just because it was the Industrial Revolution doesn't mean that everything was sunny and bright and fine for Great Britain. In fact, Great Britain was facing financial difficulties and was still struggling with it in 1847. But what it did mean was a greater level of freedom. In 1832, there was an Act of Parliament called the Representation of the People Act, which awarded a greater level of representation to the big industrial cities that had grown under the Industrial Revolution, like London or Manchester or Birmingham. Now, these cities were having members of parliament that could voice their concerns. In 1847, we had a new Prime Minister, John Russell, who is right here, who was a Whig and who came into the office of Prime Minister in 1846 when the previous Prime Minister, Robert Peel, resigned. So Robert Peel was a Conservative. He had to resign because of disputes over a law that was applying tariffs on foreign crops, and it was just in the middle of a great famine in Ireland. Robert Peel is best known for being at the source of the creation of the police forces. That's why the policemen in Great Britain are called Bobbies, because Bob is the nickname for Robert, and they were named after him. So as I have told you, 1847, that was John Russell, who was a Whig. Whig are liberals, so this was a bit of a liberal turn at the beginning of the reign of Queen Victoria. Now let's talk a little about Charlotte Brontë herself. Charlotte Brontë was the daughter of an Anglican clergyman. She had several siblings, some of whom died in childhood, but she had two surviving sisters who were also writers and who were also interested in literature. When she published Jane Eyre, she did not publish it in her own name initially, but under the pseudonym of Currer Bell. As you can see, Currer Bell is sort of a gender-neutral name, and there was a great deal of speculation when Jane Eyre was initially published about whether the writer was a man or a woman. Now, Charlotte Brontë did not come from a particularly wealthy family, which means that she had to find a job, and she worked for a time as a governess. Now, she was very interested in the works of romantic poets, especially people like Lord Byron, but also a poet named Robert Southey. At a time when she was struggling with creative difficulties, she wrote a letter to Robert Southey asking him for encouragement in her literary pursuit. Now, he did answer her. The response Robert Southey made remained famous, or should I say infamous, because he wrote her, "Literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, and it ought not to be. The more she is engaged in her proper duties, the less leisure she will have for it, even as an accomplishment and a recreation." So as you can see, Robert Southey was not really enthusiastic about having women write literature. Lucky for us, Charlotte Brontë did not heed his warnings. Now, I told you that at the beginning of the Victorian era, the financial situation in Great Britain was not very favourable, and in fact, many people from the middle classes had lost a great deal of money. That meant that Charlotte Brontë had to go to work, and she did so as a governess. So being a governess is a little bit of a strange situation. A governess is a young person, more often than not, always a woman, who is going to be a sort of private tutor for children of wealthy families. She's going to be an educator for the little girls, teach them how to speak foreign languages, how to play the piano, how to be genteel and well behaved. And she's going to also look after the boys, although the little boys are expected to go to school after a certain age, and the little girls are not. So they're going to spend maybe their teenage years as well as their childhood with a governess. So this was a very strange situation to be in, because you had young, educated women who knew several languages, who knew Latin, who knew how to paint, how to play music, who were going into different households in order to teach the little children. And this was not a very easy situation, because unlike the other servants, they were not considered lower class. They were practically equal with the masters of the house. So that meant that the other servants, the chambermaids, the butlers, had to pay them regards as though they weren't really servants. But in another way, they were also just trying to make a living, needing money, and they were not very well paid. It was not enough money for them to be saving anything. It was just enough to live on. Usually, these young women would work as governesses until such a time as they got married. So it was a transition activity. It was not meant to last their entire lives, and governesses who were still single or who still had to work when they were middle-aged faced many difficulties in finding positions, finding jobs at their age. The governess is also, for some people, a worrying figure, because it is that educated woman who comes into the household and has access to the children, has access to the family, and is sort of an equal to the lady of the house. That worried many wives who thought that the governess might try to seduce and get married to one of the young gentlemen in the house, and for that reason you had manuals which recommended ladies to hire governesses who were plain, that means who were a little ugly. Let's say a word about the critical reception of Jane Eyre. So as you know, when it was initially published, Jane Eyre was signed Currer Bell, meaning that the critics had no idea who had actually written the book. Now, Jane Eyre was considered controversial at the time it was published. There were positive critics who were impressed with the detail of description, with the realistic approach of the characters, especially of Jane herself, and one critic who even thought that it was so good that it meant the writer must have been a man, because a woman could not have that level of detail and realism. However, you also had a number of people who were very irate with the object of Jane Eyre itself. They thought it was immoral and wrong and anti-religious because, as you've noticed, there are many characters in the book who are supposed to be religious figures and who act in a way that is not proper, not moral, and not right. And that was perceived as an attack against religion and against the church. And for that reason, Charlotte Brontë, in the second edition of Jane Eyre, made a response to her critics. So the preface to the second edition starts off with Charlotte Brontë thanking her publisher and thanking the public. Then she moves on to addressing her critics. Having thus acknowledged what I owe those who have aided and approved me, I turn to another class, a small one, so far as I know, but not, therefore, to be overlooked. I mean the timorous or carping few who doubt the tendency of such books as Jane Eyre, in whose eyes whatever is unusual is wrong, whose ears detected each protest against bigotry, the parent of crime, an insult to piety, that regent of God on earth. I would suggest to such doubters certain obvious distinctions. I would remind them of certain simple truths. Conventionality is not morality. Self-righteousness is not religion. To attack the first is not to assail the last. To pluck the mask from the face of the Pharisee is not to lift an impious hand to the crown of thorns. These things and deeds are diametrically opposed. They are as distinct as is vice from virtue. Men too often confound them. They should not be confounded. Appearance should not be mistaken for truth. Narrow human doctrines that only tend to elate and magnify a few should not be substituted for the world-redeeming creed of Christ. There is, I repeat it, a difference, and it is a good and not a bad action to mark broadly and clearly the line of separation between them. So if we go back a little, what she is saying is that just because you're doing what everyone else is doing does not mean you are acting morally and properly. She says that self-righteousness should not be mistaken for religion. That means that you should not think yourself above anyone else because you think you're doing the right thing required in your religion. And she says that she is plucking the mask from the face of the Pharisee. This is a biblical reference. The Pharisees are the hypocritical priests who are oppressing Jesus in the Bible. And so she is siding with the crown of thorns, so Jesus Christ, but Jesus Christ oppressed by the hypocrites against said hypocrites. And she is also saying that to be calling out the bigots is actually a good action. To point out those who are hypocritical is to act morally and to act in a way that is religiously correct. And here you can see the daughter of the Anglican clergyman shining through. I hope all of this has helped you understand the context of Jane Eyre, and I hope that you are enjoying your read.